Hello everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today on climate justice movements and COVID-19 in the Global South. The webinar today is being hosted by the Interdisciplinary Global Development Centre at the University of York, also known as IGDC. My name's Piran White, and I'm one of the co-directors of the centre. IGDC is an interdisciplinary learning and teaching and research community for equitable global development that's based at York. We undertake interdisciplinary research with a particular focus on social justice, global health and sustainable environments. And we also offer undergraduate and postgraduate academic programs in global development. The centre brings together researchers from across the humanities and the social sciences and the natural sciences. We encourage researchers to work with one another and with policymakers and practitioners to address urgent global development challenges. Today's webinar is the third in our COVID-19 webinar series. The series is exploring different facets of the COVID-19 pandemic and how they relate to policy and research needs in global development. The series features invited speakers presenting their experience and case studies from across the world to reflect on the impact from and responses to the pandemic. We'll be asking how global development researchers can contribute to a better understanding of the impact of COVID-19 and reducing the likelihood and impact of future pandemics. Before we start the webinar, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping points. So the first one's about recording. So the session's being recorded, but only the video and audio of the panelists. So all the attendees' mics turned off, are muted, and your video is off, so you won't be recorded. And the only information that may be recorded are any questions you type in that might include your name, which could be identifiable from your Zoom name. Second thing's about questions and answers. So if you have any questions you'd like the panelists to address, please click on the Q&A button in the bottom bar. We'll then select questions from those submitted and try and answer as many as we can. You can submit your questions at any time during the presentations, but we'll only have questions and answers in one slot towards the end of the webinar. And if you notice questions in the Q&A slot that you particularly like the sound of, or questions that you were just about to ask yourself, you can use the upvote function to indicate this, and this will give them more priority when we go through and select the questions to address. For those of you who are tweeters, you can find us today on hashtag IGDC webinar. For technical support, if you're having technical issues, please use the chat function to talk to the webinar host. So just to reiterate, please put your questions to the panelists in the Q&A section with any technical issues in the chat, and that helps us to keep them separate and keep a track on things. So now I'd like to introduce our chair for today's webinar. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Jessica Omukuti, who will be chairing the webinar today. Jessica is a postdoctoral researcher at IGDC, and she brings a genuinely interdisciplinary understanding to the topic of climate justice. Jessica has a BSc in meteorology from the University of Nairobi, an MSc in climate and development from the University of Sussex, and a PhD in climate policy and climate justice from the University of Reading. And Jessica's also got a wide range of experience outside academia. So she's worked as a resilience program officer in the Mercy Corps, providing technical input to various projects in Eastern and Southern Africa. She's also worked as a knowledge management officer for the Drylands Learning and Capacity Building Initiative and as climate communications assistant for CARE International. Jessica also serves as a mentor to other African women who are wishing to progress to higher education with a view to pursuing careers in science. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Jessica. Thank you, Jessica, very much for chairing our event today. And I'll now hand over to you to get things underway.
Hello, everyone. So again, a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today, and a very warm welcome to our speakers. Today's seminar is about climate justice, specifically in the Global South. And this is a very interesting topic for me, well, first because I'm from the Global South, but also because it's a requirement for the achievement of the SDGs. And so the global inequalities in responsibility for climate change, but also inequalities in the ability to address the impacts of climate change, is the reason why debates on climate change and climate justice are very necessary. And recent debates, as you're aware, have made links between future climate action, but also between future climate action and what we do right now in response to COVID. For countries in the global south, this has very significant implications for how communities and households will be able to respond to different climate risks. But then we understand that there's differences in how climate change and climate justice should be addressed, or what it should be about, in the global north and in the global south. And so the differences is what what I'm interested in kind of bringing out. And these conversations today will start by highlighting what climate justice looks like and what movements towards climate justice look like for the global south. And so our three speakers are individuals whose research is very topical to the current political and economic situation. And their work is very much linked to today's theme. So their discussions will be based on their research in Latin America, but also sub-Saharan Africa. And our first, I think I'd like to introduce our speakers at this point. Our first speaker is Zainab Aliyu. Zainab is a Liverhulme doctoral scholar at the University of Reading. Her research focuses on grassroots organizations in sub-Saharan Africa and their contribution to transnational climate justice debates. The second speaker today is Dr. Deborah Delgado. She is a professor at PUCP in Peru. I just used the acronym because the name of the university is in Spanish, and you understand. And so one of her research interests are on the influence of indigenous social movements in resource management in the Amazon. And she will be using her research, she'll be talking about her research based on this today. Our third speaker is Prakash Kashran, and he's an associate professor at the University of Connecticut. He researches on the various intersections between inequalities, the environment, and development, and specifically in the context of environmental policy, climate justice, climate governance, and in general global development. But before we begin, I would like us to do a very quick poll. And so I think I have two polls here today. The first one will be just to get us to know where each one of us is from. And so if you look at your screens, there's, if you can just click on which region you're from. I will give you about 20 seconds, whichever region you're from or whichever one you associate yourself with. So let's start by sharing the poll results based on the region. Yeah, so we have those many people from, most of them are from Europe, and then we have a few from South Asia. Our second poll is just, let's call it a brain teaser, or just to get you thinking, is what your opinions are in relation to climate justice movements. And so how important is it that climate justice movements in the global north be informed by those in the global south? Or how important is it that they both inform each other? And so I'd like to know your opinions about this. What are the linkages? Do you think the links are important or not? Or should they just evolve on their own? We will talk about this towards the very end. So I'd like us to listen to hear from our speakers today. And then we'll just circle back to these questions on the links between climate justice movements in the North and the South and what we think the links are. And we won't talk about the global North basically, but I think it's something we'll try to quickly reflect on towards the very end. Okay, so our first speaker is Dr. Delgado. She will talk about indigenous movements, indigenous women's networks, and the responses to COVID in Peru, and what this means for climate justice, basically in reflection to now, but also thinking about the future. And so please, please help me welcome Dr. Delgado. The floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this webinar. So I would like to share with you a short presentation on the action that Amazonian indigenous women are taking to tackle and react quickly to the emergency that the pandemic COVID-19 has brought to their territories. So next slide, please. I wanted to explain you why am I sharing this beautiful graphic. So Santiago Menuhin is a very important leader in the struggles of indigenous peoples here in the Peruvian Amazon. He has been one of the main peaceful leaders around the uprisal against the changes in the law that would weaken the rights of indigenous peoples in the Amazon basin during what was called the Baguazo. And he was a very prominent leader and very peaceful and traditional leader of the Wahun people. I mean, he was a warrior, but he was a warrior that believed in the rule of law. And he that resisted so many struggles was a victim of COVID-19. So COVID-19 is having an overwhelming impact on the Amazonian indigenous peoples that were only beginning to grasp. This is true for Brazil, for Peru, for Bolivia, and Colombia. And this is because there's underlying conditions in both in the state of health that indigenous peoples have, but also in the health system that is available in the Amazon basin. So facing this context, indigenous women have acted quickly using traditional knowledge and networked organizations. And this is because their lands and lives have been affected both by climate change and by global health issues. They have a long experience organizing themselves to be part of climate policies and best protect their livelihoods. They are one of the best organized groups in the Amazonian society currently asking for climate justice. So I'm going to develop this presentation around how will post-COVID actions affect these organizations and territories, and how climate justice activists will change in a post-COVID time. Please, can you change the slide, please? So today I'm going to start by focusing on Peru and the actions of indigenous women, and then I will give a broader look to Pan-Amazonian cases, and then I will develop some of the underlying conditions to this lack of response, and then some perspectives on the future post the outbreak. Next slide, please. So what have indigenous women been doing facing COVID-19? One of the main things that we've observed is that they have recovered traditional knowledge on medicinal plants. They have been very active in gathering these plants and giving some solutions to both children and elderly. Next slide, please. But they have also worked in a networked manner to cover bigger tranches of land. So the last quotation was from Amaracaeri, which is a region, which is an indigenous territory that is placed in Madre de Dios. And this is another example from Ucayali, where Shipibo people have organized in a networked manner. They have shared their knowledge on therapeutics, and they have also developed health centers. You can see that in the photo, where they treat, they did prevention, and they treated patients with mild symptoms. This was very, very important because they managed to control the spread of the virus by these actions. Can you please change the slide? So this is one, it's actually a video, but I can't show it given the circumstances. Women, Shipibo women, they improved the way they treated the patients, and they shared in videos how to do this recipe with other indigenous peoples, not only Shipibo, but also other Amazonian indigenous peoples, because the plants they were using, some of them you can find them in the markets in the Amazon, and other ones you can find them actually in gardens, which is the matico. It's a tree that you can find in several places in the Amazon basin. Next slide, please. But at the same time, while they were acting as a network to share indigenous and traditional knowledge on how to treat the virus, they also started demands, legal actions at the national level. That was done by ONAMIAC, which is the National Organization of Andean and Amazonian Indigenous Women, that denounced in court the state because they have reacted really slowly to the emergency when it came to work with and for indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. And this way of working, this networked way of working, and this dialogue with the state if they can, and legal actions if they cannot, it comes from the lessons they have learned during their activism vis-a-vis climate change. And this is a very interesting feature because indigenous women have struggled to have a stronger voice in the indigenous movement, and they have been very proactive and quite effective. So they have learned from this experience. The photo you can see there is from the consultation process of the law of climate change in Peru. And the reasons they're taking action is because of the lack of access and quality of the health service systems, which is that long time overdue of the state in the whole Amazon basin. And you can see that most of the communities affected in the Amazon basin are indigenous communities where health conditions are prevalent, underlying conditions are pretty prevalent, such as diabetes and so on. Next slide, please. Here in this map, you can have a look to some spots where cases of COVID-19 were registered. It's not you don't have the proportions, but you can see how spread the virus is already in the basin. Next slide, please. Can you change the slide, please? Thank you. And in Brazil, the situation is quite dramatic because the political conjuncture, it's pretty hard for indigenous peoples. Bolsonaro has a very explicit position that goes against indigenous people's rights, and particularly indigenous people's rights to territory and to free, prior, and informed consent over policies and laws that may change their lands and affect their well-being. So the highest infection rates can be found, and the institutional arrangements that protect the environmental conditions of the Amazon basin have been weakened during these years of Bolsonaro's government. And you can see that as a symptom when you observe that the indigenous lands have been invaded, have been occupied by gold miners in a very significant proportion. Next slide, please. So there are several law proposals that will weaken the environmental institutional arrangement in Brazil. Those are the three main ones. Next slide, please. And then we can have a look to the Colombian situation. Colombia has also a bigger amount of cases in its frontier, close to the state of Amazonas in Brazil. And Leticia is the capital of this region, and there's a big concentration of COVID-19 cases there. It looks like the virus is spreading across the borders, and the fact that it's spreading can tell us that actually, in reality, the coordination among different countries didn't concretize, didn't exist. Next slide, please. So what changes are coming and which ones should actually come? Next slide, please. This is a photo that was taken in Ucayali. You can see how the ambulance is waiting for a patient that is coming from the communities by boat. So you can just imagine how long it takes for somebody to be taken out of their communities and what are the chances that they will reach a proper healthcare facility. So there's a lack of capacity to care for mild cases of COVID-19 in native communities, and also to properly handle these cases when they become, or when they are more serious. The situation is exacerbated by the lack of budget for the transportation of medicines and protective equipment to the communities. In addition, there's a deficit of health personnel due to the COVID-19 spread among the health personnel. Next slide, please. And in this context, where the outbreak is kind of evolving on its own, and where indigenous organizations have been very proactive to answer to the conditions by themselves without a proper support by the state, we see that there's a new pressure to reactivate the economy. And this is certainly going to happen. And one of the places where the investment wants to go is to the Amazon basin. So what kind of reactivation will we have? Is it going to be green? Is it going to be with the respect of indigenous people's rights? That's something that local NGOs and indigenous organizations are asking the government, and are research questions that the university also is pushing forward. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I would like you to bear with me and share with me some reflections and perspectives. Next slide, please. So countries in the region, in the Pan-Amazon, which are mainly the bigger ones, are Brazil with 70% of the Amazon basin, then Peru, then Bolivia, then Colombia, and then marginally Venezuela, because their forest is actually from the Orinoco, but they also have an Amazonian part, and then the Guyanas. They haven't been coordinating. Coordination has been very, very poor, although there were some programs to control the borders. We observed timid attempts to improve structural conditions on access to health services. This is a very, I say a legacy, a historical legacy that the governments are now facing. So you can see that there's a different attitude from Peru and from Colombia than from Brazil, where the government is actually openly against the well-being of indigenous peoples. But in in Colombia and Peru and in Bolivia, it's not the same case. They have a political will, but it's a mild political will. And they are facing big, big, big legacy problems. So there's no clear intention to improve this peri-urban and rural population access to healthcare. This should be a priority of the reactivation of the economy. Next slide, please. And finally, this takes us to questions about global health and how do we want to make our societies more resilient. Climate justice and climate activism overlaps very much with global health issues. And both of them should take us to a more resilient global society. And in order to have a global resilient society, we can't forget about the Amazon. The Amazon is a critical ecosystem, and the peoples that made it the way it is and keep it the way it is are indigenous peoples. So we have to take care of their well-being in a dialogical manner, talking with them because they are knowledge holders. So there should be a better distribution of resources and optimization of built and natural infrastructure and a strengthening of the social ties of solidarity that we can observe already in Amazonian societies. So thank you very much for your attention, and you can contact me at this email if you have any further questions or if you're thinking about doing research in the Amazon basin. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I think our next speaker today is Zainab. Zainab will talk to us about her work on grassroots movements.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to be a panelist on this discussion on climate justice movements and COVID in the Global South. I would like to start by mentioning that there is still a lot of skepticism across most parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly in Nigeria with regards to the existence of COVID-19. There's a lot of doubts amongst the larger population about whether this disease exists or not, or if it is even in the country at the moment. I have included a link from BBC Africa that captures the skepticism and the doubts of the general populace, or most of the general populace rather, about COVID-19. And it will be very insightful if you have the time to go through it. So to move on to the discussion about the efforts the climate justice movement in sub-Saharan Africa has been making to support COVID-19 responses in their various locations. I would say the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, PACJA, which is the largest climate justice movement in sub-Saharan Africa, has been actually very instrumental in their response to the pandemic. PACJA, which comprises a lot of CSOs, NGOs, local-based communities, and faith-based organizations spread across over 45 countries in Africa, has actually, through their members or membership in these various countries, been instrumental in organizing a lot of media campaigns, urging the public to take safety measures and precautions regarding COVID-19. There's been a lot of jingles on the radios, adverts on the TV about hand washing, using sanitizers, and maintaining social distances. For instance, I'm aware that the CS DevNet, that is the Climate and Sustainable Development Network Nigeria, which is the Nigerian chapter of the Alliance, has actually organized and conducted several trainings where they have trained over 100 participants in the aspect of making hand sanitizers and face masks using the local fabrics. Also, one of their alliance in Gabon, or partners in Gabon, has actually released a fund of $15,000, which they use to purchase food items as well as PPEs as palliatives that was distributed to the local communities and the most vulnerable of the populations. Then in Tanzania as well, I'm aware that they're actually organizing a webinar discussion to discuss the pandemic and how it affects the public At the alliance level in Kenya, the continental platform, that's through the secretariat, has organized lots of webinars with partnership with governments, researchers, and other actors from across the continent to discuss the effects of COVID-19 on different aspects of the economy, including forestry, environment, including forestry, air pollution, health facilities, and the likes of it. Moving on to their efforts in terms of recovery, I think at this point in time, the Alliance has focused most of their efforts on sensitization and awareness creation, which is very understandable going by the short video that is showed in the first slide. Nevertheless, they've actually made some efforts in terms of their engagement with the governments, both at the national and regional level. For instance, tomorrow, the Tanzania chapter of PACJA, which is Forum CC, is organizing a webinar on socioeconomic resilience in post-COVID-19, where they intend to discuss how the government and other climate actors can enhance climate change accountability and financing moving forward. Well, for the narrative or climate justice narrative changing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, personally, I would say I do not see that happening in the nearest future. What's going to happen, in my opinion, as a result of the pandemic will be a shift in focus. For instance, we know that the pandemic has highlighted a lot of the drivers of vulnerability on the continent. For example, in terms of poverty, the weak infrastructure, the insecurity issues, the uneven distribution of wealth, and the like of it. Going forward, we are more likely to see a lot of these situations or these problems being aggravated. To illustrate, I remember when the government of Nigeria first imposed the compulsory lockdown in March. Initially, it was successful for the first week or two, but then there was like a general fatigue because most of the sector or most of the people depend on the informal sector for their livelihood. And being stuck at home meant they couldn't work from home. They needed to go out to get jobs and get food on their tables. So what happened was that the country experienced a spike in crime rates. People claimed, or under the claim of being hungry or lacking food for survival, they began to become a nuisance to the society. The rates of stealing increased, the rates of violence, rape, and other criminal offenses began to rise to the extent that the communities or the middle class in the community had to pool resources together to provide palliatives in form of food items and PPE in order to secure their security. So in exchange for you not vandalizing my property, I can offer to give you food since you claim you're hungry and that's why you're stealing. And it got so bad as well that the community had to even select, some communities, particularly in areas in Lagos, had to even select able-bodied men. They had to take turns from each household to act as night watch to protect the lives and properties of people in the area. So it goes to show how climate change, which we know will most likely exacerbate these issues, and now which most likely will exacerbate these issues. So definitely, I feel the climate justice movements in Africa should focus on how they can talk about the issue, how they can create a link between climate change and security, and climate change and security. My next point would be migration. I think there should also be a focus on climate migration. Why do I say so? Because we have seen from the recent easing of the global lockdown that harsh migration policies are being directed at Africa. In spite of the fact that Africa still has the least number of recorded cases compared to most parts of Europe, they were not included on the list of those who would be exempted from quarantine. So you see, already it shows that the global north is not going to open their borders to the global south if we have issues where you have people wanting to leave the country under the umbrella of being a climate refugees. So I think the issue of security, the issue of climate migration, and also the issue of finance, climate financing for a lot of adaptation programs should actually be brought to the forefront by the climate justice movement. Most of this should focus going forward on mobilizing homegrown solutions to addressing these challenges, because relying on the global north would pose a risky ground for the continent. And finally, to answer the question of are new climate justice actors likely to emerge in the global south post-COVID-19? Well, using my case study, which is the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, I think to a large extent they've been able to mobilize a diverse group of actors from the academia, the government, research institutes, CSOs, NGOs, and all of it. But I feel, yeah, possibly there is an opportunity for new actors in terms of the national celebrities. Why do I say that? I noticed that with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been a lot of jingles and adverts, or do I say awareness creation programs on the TV, which have used a lot of these local celebrities or national celebrities. And they actually seem to connect a lot with their followers and their fans, and even people who in the beginning did not believe, perhaps because they've had it come from their favorite actors or artists, seem to be keen into this initiative. And until now, I'm not aware of PACJA harnessing this opportunity of using national or local celebrities to advocate and create awareness of the Climate Justice Alliance. So yes, I do see the national celebrities or local celebrities as a new actors that could likely emerge, but then it also require a lot of effort on the parts of the movements or movement entrepreneurs or the actors within the alliance to be able to inspire these celebrities and connect with them in such a way that they believe and they key into the climate justice agenda and help in spreading the climate justice campaign. Thank you.
Our third speaker is Prakash, who is an associate professor at the University of Connecticut. And so he will talk to us about political institutions and how they mediate resource access, use and access in global South countries. And so please go ahead.
I won't talk so much about the particular context of COVID. And you'll see why when I sort of get into this discussion. But the point is that I'm trying to sort of focus on some of the underlying forces that undermine our ability to pursue climate justice. And in fact, these forces are relevant both for global North and global South. So another sort of slight transgression that I'll do vis-a-vis the theme of the panel is to sort of not make the distinctions between global North and South so much, but really talk about the interconnectedness of the issues in global North and global South. So I take a very broad approach to climate justice, thinking about questions of recognition, procedural justice, and distributional aspects of climate justice. But the core argument that I want to make is that it's not so much about which aspects of climate justice we focus on or we miss on, but it's mainly about how do we actually think about each of these specific conceptual tools and conceptual arguments. And so in that context, I want to focus mainly on distribution, because it's kind of easier to talk about distributional justices. And while remembering that recognition actually remains the most fundamental of justice issues. Now, if we have more time during Q&A, I can talk about that. But let's just say that I'm using distributional justice as a window to talk about climate justice in a particular way. So just to give a broader context,
climate change is happening. Not just climate change is happening, but climate crisis is already upon us. And scientists have shown that the tipping points, many of the tipping points we may already be in, or these tipping points may be already on their way. And so there's no future climate crisis that we can plan for. We are already kind of running out of planning. And that takes an important meaning if you think about what kind of interventions are needed, both for climate action as well as for climate justice. Quickly, a reminder that the major forces of climate change is not this abstract notion of humanity's footprint. The major forces behind climate change are big industries like fossil fuel industry, and particularly the fossil fuel corporations. So I want to make a distinction between whatever benefits the society gets out of the fossil fuels versus how the fossil fuel benefits are shared or not shared between the fossil fuel corporations and the rest of the society. So in that sense, fossil fuel corporations are a major cause of climate change. And the sooner we can get them out of business, the better it will be both for climate action and for climate justice. So many times, and I want to emphasize this, many times fossil fuel corporations are conflated with the role that fossil fuels play in, say, questions of jobs and mining and all of that. But, all of those functions are kind of separate from what fossil fuel corporations are doing to climate politics and to climate justice. I like to think about climate justice as at a minimalist level. And by minimalist, I mean, I draw on Simon Caney's fantastic work from many years ago. And he argues that climate change threatens three fundamental human rights to life, human right to health, which Deborah talked about, and the human right to subsistence. And my argument is that when we focus on these fundamental human rights, there's actually not a whole lot of complexity to questions of climate justice. Second, I want to also demonstrate that talking about these fundamental rights does not put climate action against climate justice. So, so at that level, as long as we are focusing on the fundamental human rights, as long as we are focusing on the most marginalized groups in Global South and some in Global North, there is not actually a whole lot of conceptual complications about how should we go about it. There's a lot more sort of challenges to deal with the global and transnational political economy, which actually drives both climate change and climate injustices of various sorts. And just as I was preparing this PowerPoint yesterday, Philip Alston, who's the now former UN Special Rapporteur, he issued his final report on extreme poverty and human rights. And his argument is that the celebrations that we have seen over past decade or two about the world winning the war on poverty are actually sort of deeply flawed, and the World Bank's poverty line of $190 a day actually yields a deceptively positive picture. So we've actually not conquered the challenge of poverty in any significant way, and whatever gains have been made on the poverty front have largely been due to China's success in addressing poverty. Moreover, he goes on to argue, Philip Alston goes on to argue that misplaced triumphalism on poverty alleviation is not just that we are failing on the poverty front, but it is actually being used to actively block the kind of reforms that could have prevented the worst impacts of the pandemic. And this, I want to underline this statement that he makes in this report that was submitted to the United Nations yesterday. Philip Alston says, poverty is a political choice. And I will come back to this notion of political choice in a bit. So just to give you a sort of quick window into how I want to talk about it, I want to think about climate justice as mediated and contingent. And this kind of draws on the definition of politics by Harold Laswell, which says that politics is about who gets what, when, and how. And people have added the why questions to that definition. And in that sense, I use the example of subsidies to fossil fuel corporations as the big elephant in the room that is kind of easy to fix in a political economic sense. And it's being demonstrated by the fossil fuel divestment movement, which is a grassroots movement primarily located in global north, but has global implications, right? And so that's why I argue that it depends on the issue that we are focused on, whether there is this kind of disconnect between global north and south, or there are potential synergies between what happens in global north and global south. And so the main argument is that if you sort of take away the question of fossil fuels, on most other issues, climate justice is mainly about how we do go about the job of transitioning to a climate robust economy. It's not necessarily about which particular policies will actually bring about justice, because even something like wind power can be done in a way which contributes a whole lot of injustices in different parts of the world. So this is where my arguments about political mediation of environmental and development outcomes is relevant. And I want to sort of quickly demonstrate it by using the examples of protection of nature reserves and wildlife areas throughout the globe. If you look at the left of this graph, from 1990 to 2015 or 16, in about 25 years, the world was able to double the area of land that was designated as wildlife and biodiversity conservation zones. Now, understanding how this transition from a very low level of nature protection to a very high level of nature protection happened actually gives us great window into what might happen if we go about the task of climate transformation in the same way that we have gone about the task of doing the nature conservation. So the rapid expansion of protected areas has led to hundreds, if not thousands, of conflicts all over the world, more of them in Africa and South Asia, and some of them in Latin America. Now, this regional difference actually has a very important significance for the discussion here. And so there was a lot of discussions about these kinds of injustices caused by the expansion of protected areas and nature conservation more broadly. What I wanted to look at was what are the factors that explain the percentage of national territory that a country sets aside for nature conservation. So darker the color that you see, the greater is the proportion of protected area within countries. And many people don't actually realize that most of the protected areas have been set up in some of the poorest countries in the world. So right there, the argument that there's a fundamental conflict between development and environmental protection goes out of the window. Now, if you forget about Greenland, which I did not include in the analysis, look at sub-Saharan Africa, look at parts of Latin America. And these are areas with largest protected areas. And again, you don't see those many and the same kinds of conflicts in Latin America, South America, the kinds of conflicts that you actually see in Africa and Asia. And I want to sort of illuminate this difference with this particular argument of political mediation. So this analysis that was published in Ecological Economics in 2017 proposes a political choice mechanism. Remember Philip Alston's argument from yesterday that poverty is a political choice. And I have argued that the way we go about the tasks of nature conservation or the task of climate action, it's a political choice. There is nothing that is sort of predetermined by the nature of the challenge itself. And particularly in the context of nature conservation, the outcomes are actually reflect elite preferences, and they have actually produced these large number of unsustainable enclosures which are known as protected areas. They are completely unsustainable, mainly because the sites that were selected, the way in which it was done, and the extent of protected areas designated by these countries was driven not by a genuine interest in nature conservation, but by the elite preferences, by political and economic incentives that elites have to set aside large number of protected areas. So very quickly, the findings of this cross-national analysis from 137 countries is that controlling for everything else, all relevant political, economic, social, environmental factors, democracy per se actually has positive effects on the designation of protected areas. But if you introduce inequality within the subsample of countries that are democratic, inequality actually reduces the level of protection within democracies, because effective democratic institutions provide means for people to resist policies that they don't like. But in non-democratic countries with high levels of inequalities, you can go right ahead and set as many and as large protected areas as you can, because you can simply bulldoze over the rights and concerns of poor people. Because of the social political power differences, poor people don't actually get to protest or are not able to protest. And second, even when they want to protest, the protest can be easily suppressed, and there are no institutional mechanisms for redressal of those kinds of conflicts. So inequality can actually be good for certain kinds of nature conservation. And as we will see, it can be good for certain kind of even radical climate action. But those kinds of radical climate actions may actually produce a large number of injustices. And I want to use this example of a Trillion Trees campaign that was supported by people who we see on our side as far as climate justice is concerned. George Monbiot and Jane Goodall and Greta Thunberg, the climate activists of the day. And there is a ton of research that, many colleagues that, I work with directly, and including my own work, which shows that when you go blindly producing some types of environmental or nature conservation outcomes, such as these protected areas, they actually lead to a great deal of conflict and human rights violations. So it's not, actually important to focus on the environmental outcomes per se, but what those environmental outcomes mean for the broader ecological and social systems. So Trillion Trees campaign is not just bad for social outcomes in Global South. Good ecological research shows that Trillion Trees campaign will be a disaster for ecological integrity of planet Earth. But still you see that some of these radical climate action activists supported this. At least they supported, at least until Trump actually, co-opted the idea and then went around the town saying that I'm happy to lend my support to Trillion Trees campaign, right? So this should be a big alarm for us about how we think about the goals of climate justice. Now, I want to introduce a couple of quick conceptual discussions before sort of concluding some of the main arguments about how we should be thinking about climate justice in future. Many a times, radical action is thought about as changing the structure, the oppressive global national structural forces that are in place right now, right? So we want to go from point A, which is an unjust structure, to point B, which will be a just world, a world that is ideally both good for the environment and for social justice. And as I mentioned, conceptually speaking, there is no fundamental reason why we couldn't have it all, why we couldn't produce a world that is ecologically sustainable and socially just. But it doesn't happen because the agenda of climate action, the agenda of nature conservation itself gets appropriated through a variety of means. And the climate justice activists are at a great disadvantage, because while we are dealing with this formidable structural power difference globally and transnationally, the beneficiaries of the status quo are already working overtime to do the same transformation in a way that would benefit them, right? So to actually think deeply about a just and transformative future, we actually also need to think about what the beneficiaries of the status quo are doing in the same area of climate justice that we want to pursue, right? So we are sort of taking our eyes off from the fossil fuel corporations, which we already know should be thrown out of the business, and focusing on those processes and those programs that may sound radical, but which will actually produce deeply unjust outcomes in the long run. And so this concept is borrowed from the Science and Implementation Plan of Earth Systems Governance Project, with my colleagues in Earth System Governance Project have developed. It's a fantastic document. Please do read it, particularly for interdisciplinary research. So moving on rather quickly, I undertake. So there was a pre-recorded audio there that was kind of interfering with this, so I'll skip that slide. The argument that I showed through the cross-national research in terms of the political mediation of the relationship between environment and inequality can be understood better by sort of going deeper into the history and the politics of some of the largest countries and how they've gone about the task of nature conservation. So the book that you briefly saw on your screen, Democracy in the Woods, talks about this mechanisms of political intermediation. So the argument is that it's not the institutions of democracy as we typically understand them that are important for protecting vulnerable populations and ensuring outcomes that are socially just and ecologically robust, but it's actually the relationship between different constituencies within societies that determine how we go about balancing environmental and social concerns, right? So it's taking our sights off of the formal institutions and looking at how those institutions actually work and how those relationships are built over time, historically and in contemporary times, to facilitate a genuine debate on the challenges of thinking about social justice and environmental conservation or climate action in conjunction. So here in the book, Democracy in the Woods, I argue that the strength of political intermediation mechanisms matters more than the formal institutions of democracy, which we have seen are quite vulnerable to majoritarian and regressive politics. And again, if you happen to be, somebody who argues, I don't know, I think there are very few people in this particular group, but there are people who would argue that let's have markets operate at a larger level in globally, and we'll have better social and environmental outcomes. That is the only time when I really want to use a strong word. That argument about the role that markets can play in environmental protection has been shown to be completely bogus. And there's long-term over time data that shows that there's no empirical or theoretical basis for that kind of arguments. We need large-scale societal interventions supported by grassroots movement. And this coming together of the grassroots and large-scale interventions will actually be indispensable to producing outcomes that are socially just and ecologically robust. So at a larger level, yeah.
So we will have about a minute left. Yeah.
I'll finish in like a couple of minutes. Okay. So if you think about radical climate action, if you want to look at the goal of keeping the global atmospheric temperature increases below 1.5 degrees, you can achieve that goal by actually going about regulating and controlling fossil fuel industry, which is shown on the left graph here. Or you can go about that task while supporting the fossil fuel industry with billions of dollars of subsidies, and then looking at land and forest as a place to store carbon that is sucked out of the atmosphere. That is the last scenario, P4 scenario in this IPCC 1.5 degrees report. The left-hand scenario actually coincides with climate justices of various types. The rightmost scenario actually creates innumerable and unthinkable human rights violations. So again, the point is that this is how we go about the task of bringing about climate justice, the kind of policies that we pursue. And many climate justice movements are actually, have taken on this idea, and they're arguing that transition is inevitable. Transition to a climate robust economy will happen. The question is, will it happen at the cost of a large section of humanity, or it will happen in a way that also ensures justice? And my argument is that we need to grapple with the discourses of climate action, the discourses of justice, and how the two come together. So in conclusion, I want to make 3 quick points. I call this political mediation plus. We have to overcome carbon fetishism. We have to overcome the reductionist idea of just focusing on 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, because even 2 degrees means that some parts of the global south, tropical global south, will go above 4 degrees, right? That's almost like 4 degrees or 3.5 degrees. That's science, right? We also have to overcome this idea of let's go local. There's a lot of decontextualized localism. And again, Deborah's work shines a great light on how the policies from the national level and local level has to come together. And so finally, we have to think about climate action and climate justice in an intersectional approach. None of these are single issue struggles. And the more we can think of them in intersectional, politically oriented intersectional way, the more likely it will be that we are able to realize climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prakash. That's amazing. I think that was a very, very good discussion to kind of link up what Deborah said about indigenous networks, and you've really kind of tied up what everyone was saying in relation to environmental justice, but also climate justice. And I think we will just start off the Q&A, and we will focus on what we just, we don't have a lot of time because we had lots of connection issues, but I'm wondering whether you can just shed light on what you think the practical differences between climate justice and environmental justice.
Okay, I think for me, climate justice actually is a subset, it's not actually a subset. Environmental justice is a subset of climate justice, because climate justice also includes both environmental justice and social justice. It's not enough to talk about environmental pollution or talk about deforestation or talk about the drying of the lakes, but then you have to link it to how it affects issues of security, issues of livelihood, issues of poverty, and what have you, healthcare and all of it. So if you look at climate justice from an environmental justice perspective, then you're actually not having a holistic look at the problem. It's more like, oh, if we address this issue, then we have solved the problem, but it goes way beyond that. The issues of responsibility actually comes into it as well. Who is responsible for what? And how soon do we need to act? Why do I need to act? And if I'm able to stop deforestation, I've achieved climate justice. No, you haven't, because there are communities who are dependent on forestry for their livelihoods. You have to provide alternative sources for them. So then it links to the issue of labor and employment as well. So I think personally, I would say environmental justice is a subset of the broader climate justice movement.
Thank you very much, Zainab. I will direct the next question to Deborah, yeah. So this is a question about indigenous networks and the links to international climate change, and just not climate change, but also let's just broaden it up in relation to environmental policy, environmental and development policy debates. And so how do you think it's easy for indigenous groups to get a platform at the international level? And do you think this varies across countries or regions?
Thank you for that question. So in the Amazon basin, indigenous peoples are particularly affected by poverty and lack of access to basic services. This is the case in Bolivia, in Peru, in Colombia, in Ecuador, and also in Brazil. But Brazil has, it's even more complicated since their citizen rights, their political rights are also different from other populations. So this is one factor that we should take into account when we think about climate justice. And then the other element that we should take into account is that their lands are targeted by climate policies. So they have been engaged in the conversation and the debates about climate policy and politics because of that. So they are organized as a network, and they work to influence these elements since they are directly affected by this issue. And yeah, so this is something that they can influence, and they've chosen to organize around it. What we're going to see in the future is that they will gain an active voice, a gendered active voice. That's what I believe, because this is something that it's getting shape in all of our countries. I mean, in the Amazon basin. I think a similar trend is happening in other indigenous territories at a global level. And this is a very interesting thing, because you will see then a holistic approach that will take more into account health and education, and not only secure land tenure. So that would be, I think, an interesting trend in the years to come.
Thank you very much, Deborah. So the next question, I think, will be split between Prakash and just in very brief words. What do you think is the interaction between climate justice movements? And also, I will also go back to Zainab about this. What do you think is the interaction between movements in the North and the South? Because you thought that the distinction should not actually be made. But then in your opinion, do you think there's a difference? And also, yeah, after Prakash, quickly then we'll go to Zainab.
No, I didn't mean to suggest that the distinction should not be made. What I said was that, I think we should be talking about what kinds of movements are taking shape. So you may have, climate action movements in Global South. So, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, all of these, I call them climate movements. And I make a significant distinction between climate movements and climate justice movements. And I think, you can have climate movements that focus on 1.5 degrees without, I think there are two layers there. One, they may not be thinking so much of climate justice. That's one, I think that's less of a problem. But you may actually have climate movements who think they are, by demanding radical climate action, they are pursuing climate justice. That can be counterproductive, because it's actually, as I showed, and as other panelists talked about, there can be a number of different kinds of radical climate actions that produce a lot of injustices, right? So that's where I am at.
Okay, to answer the question, I think for me, the separation shouldn't actually be made, but I would suggest that the movements from the global north actually work hand in hand with those from the south in terms of advancing the main issues of climate justice in the south. For instance, I think the focus on the south is actually more on adaptation and survival, while in the north, the focus seems to be on mitigation. And because a lot of the funds come from the north, the global south are actually doing a lot in terms of mitigation. But then it seems that the global north are not really advancing the issues of adaptation and survival and resilience that actually is needed in the global south. So I feel if there's a more collaboration or there's more partnership between the global north and the global south, and you're able to take into consideration the core issues that affect those at the global south who are actually.
Okay, yeah, so would you just like to repeat the last few sentences you said, maybe?
Okay, I just briefly touched on the issue of priorities for the global South versus the global North. And I actually do support that they work hand in hand, but then I would advocate for the global North to take on the issues of the global South in terms of advancing more of adaptation and issues of livelihood and food security, which are the core problems facing the global South. Already, the movements in the global South are advancing the issues of mitigation, which seems to be the focus of the movements in the global North. Perhaps becomes from there, so they have to align their activities to support their own agenda funds. But it's still one-sided, so I expect the movement to the North to also champion the issues in the global South so that we have like a balance and we can work hand in hand towards achieving climate justice for all, if it's ever possible.
Can I add just one line here, which is that, I think in the main, if we make the distinction between climate movements and climate justice movements, even within global North, there are different kinds of movements, right? And they are, the traditional environmental justice movement here in the US have taken up the agenda of climate justice in a substantive way that speaks to the larger questions that are also relevant to global South. So I would say, while I think in the main, I definitely agree with Zainab's point, there are also different kinds of movements within global North, at least here in the US, and I'm sure they're also in Europe.
May I add something? For example, if you observe the UNFCCC process and how indigenous peoples of the global South and the global North do agree on some agenda items and push for some actions, you can see that the boundaries between the global North and the global South do exist, but are not as as monolithic and so separated. So in many ways, the movements of the North do understand how to relate to main concerns on climate policies and their risks. You can see that mainly in indigenous peoples movements from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand, from the US, but also, and very importantly so, in the women as a whole, like the movements of women inside the UNFCCC process and all the activism do understand the risks of taking some rather radical and ambitious policies that don't ensure rights.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And so while I'm aware that we're running out of time, and so I think I'll just pose these two questions to each one of you and ask you to also give us your final thoughts as you answer these two questions. And the first one is whether the focus on mitigation in the global North is an appropriate approach, and whether the global North should also be thinking about adaptation that is a priority for the South. But also another question that I think should also be, another question is, so one of the speakers mentioned that there should be more protected areas in the global South. And so the question was, where will these new protected areas be, and whether there is an opportunity to have more equitable distribution of protected areas. And so we will start off with Zainab. What do you think about mitigation and whether protection is actually an option for global South? And then we'll go to Deborah and then finish off with Prakash. You please just use a minute so that we can wrap this up. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I do agree that mitigation is actually an appropriate focus for the global North. But my argument, or where I'm coming from for the global South, is that in a way we are being forced as well to focus more on mitigation. Yes, we should all stop burning fossil fuels and all of it. But in reality, I think priority for us in the global south still remains adaptation. So then, because we want these monies, we have to align a lot of our projects to focus on mitigation. And then there are a lot of people who are actually already bearing the brunt of climate change, which so many of these projects do not really address. Or they might actually be pilot projects, which are just done one-off, and you come into a community, you perhaps build a water reservoir or a tap or something, and then you go off and do other mitigation projects and all of it. But you
I can take that up if, yeah.
Go for it, yeah.
So I think the point is actually not supporting the kind of protected areas that have been in the way in which they've been traditionally set up. So it's, there could be an argument about equity and that, everybody should bear equal burden of protecting nature. I think at one level that makes sense. But I think the remembering that even in global north, even in the US, the history of protected areas is paved with the dispossession and disenfranchisement of the Native Americans. So I wouldn't bring more protected areas even to most parts of the US where there are protectable forests as such. What we need to do is to actually get into this discussion of how do we need to go about the agenda of nature protection. And that involves talking about mixed use landscapes, socially productive nature conservation. And there are a variety of different models of conservation, productive. One of the scholars that I really love on this particular aspect is David Schlossberg. He has argued about sustainable materialism, right? So I think thinking about this dichotomy between nature and society and between production and conservation, that has been the most fundamental problem with the protected area model of conservation. And that, model is now, as Rob Marchant points out in the comments, now they're, talking about 50% of the planet being brought under protected areas. And in a blog post, I've referred to these protected area plans as Wilsonian enclosures, 21st century Wilsonian enclosures, because of Wilson, the ecologist who is supporting this. So I think it's a bad idea in general to take the protected area model as it is right now and to expand it anywhere. I think we should be talking about different kinds of conservation going forward.
Thank you very much. Deborah, do you want to?
Yeah, if I can pick up on that, in Peru and in Bolivia, during the last 40 years, actually, there has been several hybrid models of protected areas where there's co-management of indigenous peoples and the national services of protected areas that somehow worked very well in a period of time, and then it decayed. And it has to do with the pressure over the land use change, and the Amazon basin is a big place convoited by several interests, and in that sense protected areas do play a role because they reserve the area and give them somehow a legal status that for a while is useful. But I do agree with Prakash that it's not like this big divide that Descola and Latour and everybody is talking about we've never been modern, and the division between nature and culture is just misleading. It's there, and it's a problem. And indigenous peoples have managed, it's a good word for that, in a way that doesn't divide nature and culture. And that's why we have these ecosystems. But some protected area systems do understood that and gave them autonomy to decide. But this was very fragile, and it should not be fragile. And I think if we are talking about protected areas, we have to hear them, understand their knowledge, delocalize their knowledge, make it universal, and challenge the universal of natural cultural divide. And in this way, we get a resilient ecosystem. And experiences of that have been done already. The thing is that the pressure is so high that they broke. So how do we make it resilient to the enormous pressure that it's on the Amazon, the political pressure on the Amazon? That's a question we should be asking ourselves. And if this push for protected area and climate justice and action goes to that initiatives, or goes to the classic approach to conservation. That's my worry, because sometimes it is constructive, and we need to be clear on that. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Deborah. So we've had a very interesting discussion. So just picking up from that, I'd like to share the results of the poll that we had at the beginning of the session. I asked whether you thought there were links between climate justice in the North and the South, and that's how you can see that most people thought that it was a very important area to make linkages. And I think very few people thought it was less important. But the one thing I'd like to highlight as we kind of wrap up is that the speakers have brought up very different aspects. You've heard about the different aspects about climate justice. We've started from grassroots movement, indigenous groups, and we've spoken about the different concepts to environmental justice and climate justice, and how this looks like across the world. And that was from what Prakash talked about. But the one thing that I'd like to highlight at this point is that climate justice is really multifaceted. And my area is on climate finance, and that's something that also kind of weaves into this debate. And at IGDC, we'll be doing a lot of these discussions over the next few months, let's say that. And so if you're interested, please tune in. We'll be kind of following up with all of these issues that have been mentioned today. And maybe if the speakers would like, they'll probably come back and talk to us again in more depth. And so at this point, I'd like us to hand over back to Piran, who will just close the session for us. And before I go, thank you very much for listening in. I really appreciate your presence and your questions and your very interactive chat questions and comments. And I look forward to hearing from you again anytime soon. Piran?
Thanks very much, Jessica, and thank you to Deborah, Zainab and Prakash for dealing with the technological issues that we had, which were quite challenging today, and also Jessica for doing that. So I think everyone will agree we've had a really interesting discussion today, so thank you very much for all your questions as well. As Jessica mentioned, this is an ongoing series. The next one is actually focusing on the economic responses to Covid-19, and particularly considering economic inequalities in terms of global finance and gender. So that's going to be chaired by IGDC's Dr. Ingrid Krangraven. That's going to be on the 30th of July, and the details of that are in the chat. And also you can find out details and booking, etc., on our IGDC events section of our website. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for attending, and look forward to seeing as many of you as possible next time. Thank you, everyone. Bye.